No matter how advanced technology becomes, nature always has the final word. Out here, in the endless Arctic wilderness, there are no roads, no rescue signs, and no second chances. Only an endless sea of white, where every direction looks exactly the same. 25-year-old explorer Edward had dreamed of this expedition for years, but within a few terrifying hours, that dream became a nightmare. A violent blizzard swallowed the mountains, erasing every familiar landmark. The freezing wind roared like a living monster, pushing him backward with every step. Snow piled up around his legs, making every movement slower and heavier. His GPS had already failed, his phone battery had frozen solid, even his compass had become useless in the raging storm. Edward realized something terrifying. He was completely lost. The cold wasn't simply touching his skin anymore. It was creeping deeper, freezing his muscles and draining every bit of energy from his exhausted body. Every breath felt like inhaling knives. Every heartbeat reminded him that survival was becoming less certain with each passing minute. Hours passed. The storm refused to slow down. Edward searched desperately for anything that could offer protection, but everywhere he looked there was nothing except endless snow and silent ice. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed onto a frozen glacier rock. His body shook uncontrollably as the wind screamed around him. His frozen fingers struggled to open the small food pouch attached to his backpack. Inside, there was only one energy bar, his last meal. He stared at it for several long seconds, knowing exactly what it meant. Once this was gone, there would be nothing left. The frozen wrapper cracked as he forced it open. The energy bar had turned almost as hard as stone. Every bite became a painful struggle, and the freezing cold split his dry lips until tiny drops of blood appeared against the white snow. It wasn't enough, not even close. Within moments, the last piece of food was gone. Edward looked down at his empty hands. The hunger was growing stronger. But hunger was no longer his greatest enemy. The real danger was the storm itself. Visibility had fallen to only a few feet. The powerful wind erased his footprints almost instantly, making it impossible to know where he had come from. For the first time, fear entered his mind. Not fear of the cold, not fear of the hunger, but the terrifying possibility that nobody would ever find him. Edward closed his eyes for one brief moment, took a slow breath, and forced himself to stand. If he wanted to survive the coming night, he needed shelter. Slowly, a narrow trench began to take shape. Edward kept digging, breathing heavily as sweat mixed with frost across his face. His gloves were stiff with ice, and he could barely feel his fingers anymore. Still, he refused to quit. After what felt like hours, the small snow shelter was finally deep enough to crawl inside. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't warm, but it could block the deadly wind. Inside the cramped shelter, the silence felt almost unreal. The howling storm outside became slightly quieter, yet the freezing cold remained. Edward leaned against the icy wall, trying to catch his breath. His entire body trembled uncontrollably. As he reached into his jacket for anything useful, his fingers touched something unexpected. A photograph. Carefully, he pulled it from his inner pocket. The edges were frozen and creased, but the smiling faces were still there. His family, the people waiting for him back home. For a long moment, the freezing cave disappeared from his mind. He remembered laughter, warm sunlight, home. A small smile appeared across his exhausted face. He pressed the photograph tightly against his chest and whispered a promise. I will come back. That single promise became stronger than the storm outside. But the night was... He suddenly felt warm, dangerously warm. His eyelids became heavy, his thoughts slowed. The freezing darkness whispered a simple lie. Just close your eyes. You've done enough. Rest for a while. Edward knew exactly what was happening. Hypothermia. His own body was trying to trick him into giving up. With the last of his strength, he slapped his face hard. The sharp pain brought him back. No, not tonight. He rubbed his frozen hands together again and again, forcing himself to stay awake. As long as his heart was still beating, he still had a chance. The darkness inside the snow cave became heavier with every passing minute. Edward stared into the silence, struggling to stay awake. His frozen hands barely responded. His breathing was slow, and his vision drifted in and out of focus. Then, a warm orange glow appeared near the entrance. For a brief moment, he saw a cozy fireplace burning gently. He imagined the comforting heat on his face. He could almost hear the laughter of his family and smell a warm meal waiting for him. It felt so real. He reached out his hand, but the warmth disappeared. The fire was gone. Only cold snow remained. Edward shook his head, forcing himself back to reality. He understood the cruel truth. His exhausted mind was creating illusions. The mountain wasn't trying to comfort him. It was testing him one final time. He clenched his fists, straightened his back, and whispered to himself, "Stay alive." Minutes felt like hours. The endless night seemed as if it would never end. But then, something changed. The violent wind slowly faded. The silence became peaceful. A single beam of golden sunlight pierced through the entrance of the snow cave, lighting the frozen walls like a promise of hope. Edward opened his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. Slowly, he crawled toward the entrance. The storm was over. Outside, the Arctic wilderness looked completely different. The sky glowed with brilliant shades of gold, orange, and blue. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the morning sun, and the endless silence no longer felt frightening. With trembling legs, Edward stood up. He looked across the frozen mountains that had nearly taken his life. He had survived. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the fastest, but because he refused to surrender. He removed his snow goggles and took one deep breath of the cold morning air. Tears rolled down his face, melting the frost that covered his skin. Once again, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the family photograph. This time, he gently kissed it. "I kept my promise," he whispered. Holding the photograph close to his heart, Edward took his first step toward home. Behind him stood the small snow shelter that had protected him through the longest night of his life. Ahead of him stretched a new path, a path filled with hope. Nature had pushed him to his absolute limit. It had stolen his strength. It had tested his courage. It had challenged every part of his spirit. But it failed to break the one thing that mattered most, the will to survive. Sometimes victory doesn't mean defeating nature. Sometimes victory simply means refusing to give up. And on that frozen morning, beneath the first light of a new day, Edward walked forward, not as a victim of the storm, but as a survivor.